You could, if you prefer to call me Pi, sure, go ahead. I really
Hello.
don't care.
Hello, this is Adrian Shepard with Springtime Nations, and I am here with Pi from Quebec, and he has some very interesting things to tell us about the trucker protest that has taken the Canadian nation by storm. Pi, why don't you tell us a little bit about how the trucker protest has affected Quebec, and then we will go from there.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you for your invitation. As far as I'm aware, the trucker protest in Quebec has been received approximately the same way as it has been received across Canada and more broadly speaking, across the Western world, with a general division across political and even, I would say, cultural lines. People who would generally associate themselves with the political left have received the Freedom Convoy in a very negative way, whereas people that would identify as right wingers have largely identified this as a salutary moment in Canadian politics. Of course, broadly speaking, whether it be in Quebec or in the Western world, nobody really saw this coming, especially from Canada, because of its emblematic symbol of consensus politics. What I think would be interesting to see is how what is the significance exactly of this emerging specifically from Canada because of its symbol in the collective Western imaginary of Canada as the pinnacle or emblematic symbol of consensus politics?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, if you had asked the average liberal American or the average conservative American whether or not there would have been some mass anti-vax, anti-mandate protest happening in Canada, I think you would basically get a resounding no. And yet,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. The reason why this is the case, I would say, is because Canada as for at the very least 2 or 3 decades now, been seen as the home of what came to be understood in political science as post politics. That is a displacement of the concept of the political outside of politics to be replaced instead with certain considerations about identity, about morality, which has led to a general agreement within the political elite about where we should be going and how we should be handling things. That means very little consideration about how the general population would perceive these things, and instead moving forward with a set of administrative considerations. Now, Canadians themselves have a long history of perceiving themselves as a consensual people, as a very non-confrontational people, and that has been reflected also in the imaginary that the West has of Canada. The fact that this has come from Canada demonstrates a sharp discontinuity between the hegemonic discourse on consensus and the agonistic nature of populism, that is, the oppositional nature inherent in populism as a return of the concretes of politics.
So when we're talking about post politics, I think it's useful to go back to the roots of how this happened in Canada, how Canada became this poster child for post politics. Could you bring us back there?
Yes. So Canada has seen for, at the very least, perhaps 50 or 60 years, a general dynamic that created the way that they engaged in politics. The main question had been for a long time the Quebec issue, the Quebec national issue. You had a very strong independence movement in Quebec, which started increasingly becoming violent in its demands. around the 1970s, which eventually came to culminate in the October crisis of 1970, where the Canadian government declared the Emergency Act, the very same Emergency Act that has been declared against the Freedom Convoy. Now, of course, at that time, we could argue that at that time, the declaration of the Emergency Act was legitimate because of the violent nature of the more militant wing of the independence movement in Quebec. But it should be remembered that this decision of the Canadian government to declare the Emergency Act actually increased the sentiment of French Canadians that there is a necessity for independence. In fact, 6 years later, the leading sovereignist party in the provincial election ended up winning 71 of the 110 seats available in that election. Eventually, even in 1978, we had the beginnings of the representation of sovereignist politics in Canada via the Bloc Québécois on a federal level. So rather than stifling the sovereignty movement in Quebec, we saw a massive resurgence of these politics as a result of that suppression. Of course, the reaction of the Canadian government was ambivalent, as we know from the coming referenda as a result of that movement's demands. One of that reaction from the Canadian government at that time was the development of the concept that came to be seen as part and parcel of how the West conceives itself, which is the concept of multiculturalism. For a long time, the Canadian government thought that one of the ways that they could successfully handle the Quebec national question was to declare Canada a binational nation. Eventually, that came to be seen as providing a little bit too much leeway for the French Canadians, and the Liberal government under Pierre-Elliott Trudeau decided to instead provide the Canadian Constitution with an added element to declare itself instead as a multicultural society, resulting in the symbolic and institutional diminution of powers for the national independence movement of Quebec. Now, the specific aspect when it comes to the post-political element, I would not say is specific to Canada, but instead broadly applies to the shift in politics that has occurred with the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is, for a long time in the Western world, politics was demarcated between considerations on economics, on concrete ideological questions of how society ought to be organized. But with the eventual stagnation that came to overtake the Soviet Union and leading to its eventual collapse, we saw a reconsideration of how politics ought to be handled. In fact, I would argue that this process was largely that of depoliticization of political philosophy, with a movement towards considerations on ethics and individual behavior, where there is a sort of a systematic foreclosure of the properly political that is defined with the identification of an enemy and a friend.
That sounds, if I may say, very Schmittian.
Absolutely. The concept of the political as essentially being defined by a friend-enemy distinction is, properly speaking, a Schmittian way of conceiving politics. But it is important to remember that while this remains Schmittian nature, it does not mean that it is somehow a far-right conception. In fact, that understanding of politics became so thoroughly accepted as being an adequate understanding of how politics operates specifically within the context of democracy that many of the of left-wing philosophers ended up accepting this. For example, Chantal Mouffe, who is responsible for the emergence of left populism in the West, is herself a self-identified left-wing Schmittian. This idea has also been integrated even among the more consensus-driven forms of the American establishment with the Straussians. As we know, there had been a very interesting dialogue that had occurred between Schmitt and Leo Strauss that led to the reedition of the concept of the political by Schmitt, wherein the considerations led by Strauss allowed him to deepen his understanding of politics. But what is important here, I would say, is not whether or not this understanding of politics is Schmittian, but instead how this understanding of politics, specifically in the context of democracy, has been completely been pushed aside with the emergence of this form of consensus politics that Canada embodies, and has now seen a resurgence with populism, and more specifically with the Freedom Convoy.
So, would you say that the Freedom Convoy and results from it could lead Canada to break from this concept of the meta-political and consensus politics?
The way that I would see it is that, as far as I can make out currently, I would not expect this to be something that would impact Canada in the immediate, in a very, I guess I would say, transformative way. What I would say instead is that this moment more or less demonstrates that Canada has already undergone its transformative moment. There is already the integration of a post-consensus politics in Canada. We see this with the language that is being used by the Canadian government and the Freedom Convoy with regards to how they attempt to breach each other's barriers and create a dialogue by essentially rendering this dialogue impossible. For example, the Liberal government has declared that the Freedom Convoy represents basically the worst of Canadian society, that these people are racists, they're white supremacists, that they are sexists, and the Freedom Convoy has responded by classifying the Canadian government, the Liberal government, as being essentially tyrannical, fascist, and communist. Of course, it is entirely impossible to have a dialogue with somebody that you consider to be essentially a moral reprobate. You cannot have a genuine consensus to be built with somebody of that moral depravity. The only thing that can be done in that situation is to identify them as the enemy to be defeated. And this, I think, will not necessarily lead to any further transformation in Canadian politics outside of the deepening of that tendency, but will instead accelerate this form of resurgence of the political, almost, I would argue, on a cross-national level. And the reason why I say this is because what we're seeing, one of the elements that is the most interesting, I would say, with regards to the Freedom Convoy, is how we're seeing national consideration slowly evaporating away, and instead cultural considerations taking the front. Now we see that, for example, right-wing Americans identify themselves so strongly with the Freedom Convoy that they represent the majority of the donators towards the Freedom Convoy, even less than the Canadian right wing themselves. Whereas the liberal wing of Canada sees them as absolute enemies. I think the cross-pollination between the Freedom Convoy and the American right is perhaps a more interesting element to explore.
I remember, certainly as an American, it was very surprising to me that there was such a robust resistance to the mandates and the lockdowns from Canada. And I know this was a general feeling all over the American right. And I know just as well, from the American left, it was just as surprising that this would happen in Canada, which for many liberals is the ideal country from a North American perspective.
That has also been something that has struck me as a very interesting aspect of why it is significant that this has come from Canada. The impact that may come as a result of this, at least on the level of the collective imaginary, is that Canada representing the ideal state for liberals inside of the United States means that for the average American that is on the left, the right cannot represent anything other than a direct and frontal assault to civilization. Whereas for the right, that has come to identify itself with the Freedom Convoy, the left can only mean the absolute tyrannical crushing of the essential values that creates civilization. That is the principle of freedom.
Yes, and it's funny you use the term freedom, given that now apparently this is a right wing buzzword in Canada. The way the quote Freedom Convoy has covered itself in the rhetoric of freedom has gotten not just Canadian outlets but also American outlets quote re-examining the white supremacist roots of freedom. I don't want to
Yeah.
spend too much time on this in itself because I think that is a bit of a conservative versus liberal rabbit hole that is kind of a waste. But it is worth noting, I think, that these battle lines have been drawn based on rhetoric as straightforward as freedom versus tyranny.
Well, I actually think it's a really interesting point to note in their rhetoric that is being displayed, because what I think this reveals is that the opposition between liberal and conservative has now crystallized into two blocks that no longer can speak to each other. It simply is impossible at this point. For the right, the concept of freedom is paramount insofar as as civilization building goes. A civilization is such when it can maintain the possibility of living freely. Whereas for the left, it is instead the principle, I would say, perhaps more of equality or of community that constitutes the essential structuring value of civilization. So here we're actually seeing in the rhetoric the crystallization of the emergence of the concept of the political, where the essential values of each other are now being seen and drawn as evils. Freedom is white supremacist, and then on the other hand, equality is seen more or less as the beginning of tyranny. And this moment might actually accelerate that perspective for right wingers, considering the reaction that has been launched by the liberal government.
So, yes, we have a moment where freedom means white supremacy and equality means tyranny. If we have a society where roughly half of the population believes in each, is a confederation such as Canada possible?
Well, that's a good question. And like I said, I'm not exactly sure if this this anthropological division is going to necessarily affect Canada specifically, because as far as I can make out, this anthropological split that is occurring right now is really across the West, broadly speaking. The identity of each other is no longer defined on a national level. Now we're at a point where these anthropological differences have reached such a terrible chasm that is perhaps unbridgeable at this point, that identification occurs more or less on a cultural level, where a right winger in America has more in common with a right winger in Canada than with a left winger in America. This, I think, could be significant because, as we already know, America is a deeply divided country where, at the very least, 41% of Biden voters and 52% of Trump voters consider that it could be time to split the country along blue and red states. So, is it possible for Canada to maintain a confederacy? I think is perhaps not the right question. I think the right question would instead be, is it possible to maintain a nation, any nation in the West, where such deep divisions lead to a moment like the Freedom Convoy? That it comes from Canada is only more impactful by the fact that Canada stands as this epitome of post politics. As such, the Freedom Convoy represents the abysmal failure of post politics. And deeper than that, it represents the impossibility of having a dialogue between the left and the right in America. Could it lead to the disintegration of the Canadian Confederacy? It could, but more importantly, could it lead to the possibility of new forms of identification on cross national cultural frontiers that lead to a movement of populations that could perhaps accelerate this tendency towards national divorce in the United States?
Right. When you say movements of nationalities, are you envisioning something like right wing Canadians moving to the United States, or perhaps vice versa, or right wing Americans seek to do what libertarians have done in New Hampshire and basically mass move to somewhere like, say, Quebec or Alberta and basically make some kind of right wing stronghold there?
I think that what I would see as more of a possibility at this point would be an acceleration of the existing tendency within the United States, where there's an increasing amount of conservatives in blue states moving to red states and forming these kinds of culturally homogeneous communities that don't have to tolerate people that they consider to be moral abominations. I think it is possible that we could see right wing Canadians moving to the United States. For example, southern states or Texas would be a very viable possibility. But I think what I would envision more realistically would be, for example, the Texas independence movement increasingly becoming more brazen in the realization that they have to be independent if they want to truly live according to their own values and standards.
So we already briefly talked about you are from Quebec, and just for listeners at home, Pi is what you would call a Quebec nationalist. Where does Quebec fall in all of this?
I think that right now Quebec stands as a sort of an interregnum, because Quebec for a very long, for 50 years at least, has had its politics, like those of Canada more broadly, defined by the division on whether or not you are for the Canadian Confederacy or you are for Quebec as a nation. And with the right wing populist moment, what we have seen is a sidestepping of that question for instead a reaffirming of the essential characteristics of Quebec as a nation, the cultural values of Quebec, with, for example, the CAQ government, who is self identified as a nationalist government, but maintains that this nationalism can operate within the confines of the Confederacy. But from what I sincerely believe is that despite this interregnum, the question of Quebec independence will inevitably come back to the fore. It is simply a matter of time as time goes on, first and foremost because of the increasing impossibility of having different identities and different anthropological systems coexist under a shared set of institutions, as we have seen, for example, with the increasing division in American politics, but also simply because of the fact that Quebec's own interests does not lie in trying to have the Confederation listen to what it has to say.
So you are long term very bullish on the possibility of Quebec nationalism qua independence.
Yes, absolutely. I would like to see Quebec become an independent nation state.
Would you say the truckers that were in Quebec are primarily Quebec nationalists or Canadian nationalists? Or maybe, to be more specific, are they right Canadian nationalists?
I think that right now, the French Canadians who go to the Freedom Convoy, I would expect them to be people that come from a background of Quebec independence politics. But I think that they are participating in this moment not as independentists, but as partisans of freedom in what they consider or what they perceive to be an anthropological struggle against tyranny. The significance for Quebec independence is precisely on the point of freedom. You know, Quebec independence as a movement derives itself on the principle of freedom. So I would say it's not exactly that they fight as Quebec independentists, but it is more a coherence in political principles that leads to this continuity and struggle.
So I don't want people coming away from this that you or I are Pollyannas about this kind of thing, and we simply believe that the Canadian or the Quebecois people believe they have the courage of their convictions, and they're gonna have victory because they want it more, or something like that. You actually have studies that you've looked into that show that secession, national divorce, these kinds of things are extremely possible based on things that have already happened in the world, don't you?
I do, yes. Recently, we have seen a drastic increase in what we could call political violence, which directs us to the works of a man by the name of Peter Turchin, who has developed a system called cliodynamics that allow us to make predictions about the nature of politics, but more precisely about where we are headed as a society when it comes to cultural evolution. What Peter Turchin has noted is that because of the increasing overproduction of elites and the incapacity to fulfill the demand of elite jobs for this increasing amount of elites, there is an increasing amount of intra-elite competition that undermines the essential cooperative basis that is needed to maintain a society together. This leads to increasing fragmentation, and it leads to a large class of people that have the capacity to be a constituted power as an elite with, you know, well-educated, highly capable people denied access to those elite positions. Of course, these people don't tend to just stick around and look at the sky and wait for something to happen. Those people are unhappy, they're disgruntled, and they tend to organize themselves to get what they believe is rightfully theirs. What we're seeing, I think, is this increasing fragmentation of society across anthropological lines and across cultural lines, where we can imagine, and in fact, we are already seeing this, a segment of the this disgruntled and I guess you could say déclassé elite allying itself with the rising right wing populists to operate what would essentially be called a circulation of elite, as was developed by Pareto in his concept of regime change. Now, I think it's important to remember that throughout history, moments of the circulation of elites have rarely been peaceful. This has quite often been a very violent moment in human history. One could argue that those were moments of necessary violence to accelerate the tendency of cultural evolution that was stagnating because of this overproduced elite. But I think that it is important to allow people to discuss the necessity of secession across these cultural lines, because the alternative would be direct physical conflict between different peoples that consider each other to be enemies, essentially.
Yes, I think it is a very big part of secessionist rhetoric, and I don't think this is disingenuous at all, that secession is often the best way to deal with intractable issues.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, at this point, if we were to simply use legal language, we've reached a point where we've reached what would be called, for example, in divorce law, irreconcilable differences. It is impossible to imagine how someone that conceives of his compatriot as a fascist and the other as a communist could come to truly see eye to eye and fix whatever issue they consider to be basically breaking away at their democracy, at their social fabric.
Yes, I think if we take social contract theory seriously, especially when it comes to federated states such as Canada or the United States, the idea that the constituent parts would basically see each other as enemies is very
Right.
analogous to a divorce where both parties have irreconcilable differences, which is why I think the rhetoric of national divorce has gained so much traction, because it really does capture the sort of, you could see it as a tragedy, but a necessary but painful process we have to go through once we realize that we aren't a nation, we are two nations or more.
Right. Perhaps even more, if we're honest.
Definitely,
Um,
yes. America, as much as Canada has very many different cultures. I would not be surprised if, given one Canadian secession movement, that others would not join them, not the least being Quebec.
right. I mean, I agree entirely, and I think it's actually interesting that we're bringing this to the level of national identity, because more or less right now what we're seeing is that on the basis of social contract theory, what previously maintained the nations that we see today in the West as nations, that is, the democratic foundation of the people as bearer of the constituent power that constitutes the legitimacy of the institutions that governs them, has completely broken off. It no longer maintains itself. In fact, we just have to look at studies that have been revealed where popular disapproval of basic institutions of society, whether it be the media or the government itself, or anything that really plays a constitutive role in a democracy, has absolutely abysmal approval ratings. We see that the social contract, as has been created by the Enlightenment theorists, is currently completely collapsing. Instead, what we are seeing with the emergence of right wing populism is the reconsideration of nation, not as a demos, not merely as a politically constituted discursive force that creates constituent power, but also as primarily an ethnos, that is, a cultural identity, a way of living, an anthropological formulation. And it's on that level that we are currently seeing the split occurring, where a right wing in America has more in common with a right winger in Canada than vice versa.
The members of the Springtime Nation in 1848, as liberal as they were, and they were very liberal, they believed in the Enlightenment. Ultimately, they also believed in an ethnos. There is no denying that these men would have seen the same love of ethnos in all these movements from Portugal all the way to Russia of this insurgent right nationalist populism.
Right. I mean, you're essentially correct to note that what comes off today and what is identified today as liberal has very, very little to do with the classical liberalism of the people that had led the springtime of nation. In fact, I would argue that those people would more or less be identified as reactionaries today, because while their texts and their arguments and their political philosophy never mention the categories of the family or patriarchy or the ethnos, the historical context makes it such that in their minds, these things were inseparable from their political philosophy. Their political philosophy was to be understood within that historical context, within those parameters that they considered to be essential for the application of their ideas, not as an abstraction as it has come to be bastardized into with the progressive liberal left. But I think even further than that, while they also understood the necessity to construct a national identity first and foremost on a shared cultural identity, they understood, for example, that peoples did not emerge from the sky, and you can't really mix water with oil and expect something to happen except separation. Another aspect that is important to keep in mind is the technological basis behind the formation of a nation back in that era. Today, cultural identification, which they understood as foundational for the creation of a nation and the maintenance of that nation and national health, today cultural identification, thanks to digital technology, occurs more rapidly outside of the national frontiers that we have come to know, and increasingly allows for people to see themselves as belonging to a broader cultural community that goes beyond their national frontier. And perhaps we could see this as being the beginnings, the seeds to be sown of future secessionist politics based on these cultural identifications rather than national frontiers that we are seeing now. Of course, I think that that would be a very positive step forward, a much more voluntarist approach to politics, where no man should be seen as needing to live under a system of rules that he does not see fit for himself or his nature.
Yes, I hope you're right. I hope that technology makes it easier and easier for nationalism and liberalism to be cheek to jowl as they were
I
in
agree.
the 19th century.
I think we could definitely see the preponderance of digital technology today as a stepping stone towards secessionist politics across cultural frontier, across cultural identifying markers and cross nationally. I think, in fact, there has been recently a study that came out, a very interesting study that shows the more people are involved politically online, and the more that they use technology as a means of socialization, the less likely that they are to engage in their local and national politics, and the more likely they are to see themselves as belonging to communities that operate on the digital level. Another interesting aspect that I think should be noted is that it was not noted that this preponderance of the digitalization of socialization did not negatively affect real life friendships or family ties, which I think would be an interesting thing to note, because it shows to us that it is not merely a tendency towards anti socialization, but instead a tendency towards having the possibility to choose beyond the conditions that have been imposed.
Well, I certainly think studies like this are the path forward for a real libertarian policy of people forming like minded polities, not simply on the basis of birth or language, but shared interests, shared politics, etc. Pi,
Absolutely.
you have been a wonderful guest. I thank you, and on behalf of you, I bid our viewers good night.
It's been my pleasure.